This is a lecture for chapter 1.5, Bias and Sampling. So we've left off talking about sampling methods and ensuring that we wanted to make sure when we collect data, where we collect data from, the samples from the population, that the way we do it ensures that we have a representation of the population, that we sample in a ways that so that when we collect the data, it actually can be used to make conclusions about the population from the sample. So with that in mind, we need to keep in mind this idea of what's called bias. And bias, again, this idea of bias results when the sample are not representative of the population. We say we have bias. And this bias occurs many ways. And the kind of three ways we look at it are called sampling bias, non-response bias, and response bias. And so we'll be looking at those. So on your note sheets, the first question is define bias. That's the first question. And so that definition that I showed on the PowerPoint, when the sample is not representative of the population, we have bias. And again, an example of that is, let's say we want to interview a population of equal amount of males and females. We want to know what population thinks, and we interview 90 male and 10 female. There's going to be some bias potentially in that. That's not representative of the population, which would be 50-50. And so those sources of bias, again, sampling, response, non-response. So what is sampling bias? Looking at the first one, right? So sampling bias means that the technique used to obtain the individuals to be in the sample tends to favor one population over the other. And so that's what I was, sampling bias means the technique used to obtain the individuals to be in the sample tends to favor one population over the other. Let's say we want half males, half females, and whatever we do, we end up with 90 males and 10 females. There's going to be some bias in that. There's another term called undercoverage, and that occurs when the proportion of one segment of the population is lower in the sample than it is in the population. So my example of 90 male and 10 female would be an example of undercoverage for females, right? We just don't have enough people that are representative. The next one was this idea of non-response bias. When does non-response bias exist? Well, non-response bias exists when individuals selected to be in the sample do not respond. So for example, we keep asking people a survey question and people don't respond. So if you have too much non-response, we don't have an idea of what that group of people thinks. So our results could be skewed or incorrect because we just don't have a response from a certain group of people. And so there's a tool they use to control non-response bias. It's somewhere here on our PowerPoint. Non-response can be improved through the use of callbacks or rewards or incentives. So this idea that that you're able to just call people back if you're on phones, or if you're calling phones, or rewards or incentives, you pay somebody to do a survey. And so that's one way to ensure that you have you remove non-response bias, right? Or incentives. You could pay people to be part of the survey. And then this idea of under what conditions does response bias exist? Well, it exists when the answers on a survey do not reflect the true feelings of the respondent. And so response bias, for example, happened, I think, with the last presidential election, right? People asked, are you going to vote for Trump or not? But many people didn't admit to they were going to vote for Trump, and then they did when no one was looking. And so the answers on the survey did not reflect the true feelings of the respondent. So that's an example of response bias, and we'll talk more about certain specific ones. There's other ways to get response bias. It can happen through interviewer error, the way the answers are presented, the wording of the questions, the ordering of the questions, even the type of questions, is it true or false, yes, no, open-ended. Right? An open question allows the respondent to choose his or her own response. So there's a lot of different ways response bias can happen. And so we have to take that in consideration. And so now we have some other terms here we want to look at. on our PowerPoint. We'll get there. One is data entry error, and then non-sampling error. So let's look at data entry error. Although it's not a result of response bias, data entry error will lead to results. Just someone entering the data wrong. Like you collect the data and hold on. Let's go back and correct my my statement on that last page. Non-sampling errors are errors resulting from sampling bias, non-response bias, response bias, or data entry error. So it has nothing to do with the sampling, and so that goes back to here. These are non-sampling errors right here. So it had nothing to do with your method. Non-sampling had nothing to do with your method. It just is going to occur as a result of some of these other things, not necessarily your sampling technique. So non-sampling errors. And then this last one here, you can see from our PowerPoint, sampling errors occurs when you do some issues with your sampling. So you have sampling errors. Is an error that results from using a sample to estimate information about a population. This error occurs because the sample gives incomplete information. So there's something wrong with the sampling aspect. And that's chapter 1.5.